Okay, so welcome back, everybody. As we were saying before, one second, change my view here. Okay, anyway, welcome back, everybody, and welcome to anyone who's joining for the first time new. Before we even begin, I just want to give a proper thanks, Hakar Satov, to Tzipi and Jerry Hawk in commemoration of Jerry's father's yahrzeit, Tzvi Elazar ben Arav Yishaya. So they sponsored the shir in his memory for his yahrzeit, as well as Max and Debbie Rudman for the third yahrzeit of Debbie's father, Nati, aka the cowboy. Someone will have to explain that one to me, Max, okay, tomorrow.
Okay.
And naming Charles Natan ben Zev HaKohen on Yud Ches Mar Cheshvan. So both of their neshamas should have an aliyah, and thank you again for sponsoring, and Lava Karsato for that. Okay, so as far as, let's just do a quick chazara. We'll review what we saw last week just briefly. So we talked about last week, before we go on, that there are a number of mitzvos that apply for Shemitah, right? A number of commandments that we have. And on one hand, the mitzvos very much relate to the land itself. You can't work the land. We can't have the land work. But it's not just on the land itself, it's on us, that we ourselves can't work the land, specifically as Jews, which means that anything that we do work or anything that comes from our fields and the like is actually, what we would call Kedusha Shviya, sacred fruits. And those are specifically what we're going to learn about tonight. But last time, and the reason why we're going over this is we'll see it very much ties into what we're doing today. Last time, not only did we talk about the nature of the prohibition, the nature of the Isser to work the land during Shemitah, but we also touched upon the ideas, the concepts, the hashkafos behind it. And the main hashkafa that we really came out with is a realization that we can't work the land can't be worked, and we really can't gain from any of that work during Shemitah in order to recognize that we're not the Bailam, we're not the owners of the land. Certainly not anywhere in the world, and all the more so Eretz Yisrael, which Hashem gifted us. And to realize that we don't control anything, meaning our lives are not our own, our fruit is not our own, our lands are not our own, they're all Hashem. And everything is a gift from Hashem. And one second. So not only that, but we realize that it's to try to highlight that we are not the Bailam, we are not the owners over this. And that's all of Shemitah. And there are other ideas that we talked about, but I'm harping that just because we're going to get into this and we're going to see how many of the halachas that we're going to be learning have a lot to do with that hashkafa, that philosophical concept. So let's go in. So we're going to talk about the fruits during Shemitah. Now, just a disclaimer. The fruits that we're going to talk about now about Shemitah are assuming that a person didn't go through any of the other routes that Ray Rosenbaum will talk about next week. As we'll talk about tonight we're going to focus on the fruits that a person has access to during Shemitah, and that we're going to assume were not grown by non-Jews, we're not grown through certain sales, we're not grown on raised platforms. We're going to assume for the night that all the fruits that we're talking about are halachic fruits in terms of Shemitah, and they have a certain kedusha to them, they have a certain holiness. So let's see source one, right? We have to start somewhere with the psukim. So we did see these last week, but each week we have to revisit the psukim because the details are very much there. So in source one, on the first page over here, in Parshas Bahar, the psukim say, "V'haisa Shabbos haaretz lachem la'achla," that it'll be that it'll be a rest for the land, but you'll also have it be resting that you should be able to eat it. That anyone who's dwelling in the land, anyone is able to have access. Because again, what we talked about last time was all fruits become hefker, they become ownerless, and that's one aspect of the mitzvah. And we'll get back to that. But again, it all becomes ownerless, and we all have permission to eat it. Which means if you're passing by your friend's field, if you're walking this way, that way, you see a little orchard, you see a little tree. So technically, all things being equal, you could go and take it and eat it because everything is ownerless. We don't own anything. In the second pasuk, in the first source, it says, and that all the fruits and everything and all the produce will be for the animals of the field within the land. So that is that we can't work it, we don't own it, and it's for everyone and everything. So from here, source 2, the Gemara Yerushalmi, and I brought the Yerushalmi because it's stated there very specifically, but we really see it in many places in halacha when it comes to Shemitah. We learn that all fruits that are grown during Shemitah, and again, it's not because a person is growing them himself, but a farmer does his work before Shemitah, and things end up growing during Shemitah. So anything that is produced during Shemitah from the land has an inherent certain sense of holiness. And we'll have to know what we have to do with that. So in source 2, the Gemara Yerushalmi says, Ki yovel hi, that it'll be that you'll have this 50-year cycle. You'll have Shemitah every 7 years, but then you'll have the 50-year cycle of Yovel. And Kodesh Yelachem, and it will be a sacred year. Just as Shemitah, we know, is a sacred year. It's a year where we don't involve ourselves with working the land. But here's the key line. Ma hi kodesh atvu asa kodesh. Just as the year is sacred, so too all the produce from that year is sacred. Now that's the line right there. What that means is all the produce that is grown during Shemitah, and again, assuming it was not grown by non-Jews, it was not grown through some sale of the land, it wasn't grown on raised platforms, all of those will be discussed next week and how to deal with that. But assuming it grew on the land of Israel, and specifically on the ground, owned by a Jew and the like, so it has a certain inherent holiness to it. So what does that practically mean for us? So what it means is there are a lot of halachos, a lot of laws that apply to it. And those laws are going to be applicable to that fruit, whether they're in Israel or out of Israel. We'll talk later whether or not we can take the fruits out of Israel. But even if one did, so those fruits maintain a certain kedusha, a certain holiness, and they have to be treated accordingly. So the first question of the night is there a mitzvah to eat Shemitah fruit? I have produce that was grown during Shemitah, right? It was obviously planted and everything before Shemitah, but now comes Shemitah and it grows, and the Gemara and Halakha is telling us it has inherent holiness. So, all right, I like holy things, my body likes holy things, my body likes food. Okay, let's eat it, right? Is there a mitzvah to eat it? So I have to figure this out, right? Because you've got many choices of things you can eat during Shemitah. So if it's a mitzvah, maybe I should try to get produce that maintains that status of kedusha, that status of holiness, and that's what I should be eating all year. And hey, even in America, you can export things these days, no problem. So maybe we should all be eating Shemitah, Shvius, that is. So in source 3, the Ramban comments, and he says, mitzvah shlishis sha'amra Torah, the third mitzvah that the Torah enumerated when it came to the fruits of Shvius, the fruits of the 7th year, it says, "V'haisa shavas haaretz lachem la'ochla." It says, "The land shall rest in a way that you shall eat it. You shall eat from it." So seemingly, and he says, "V'darshu la'achla v'lo l'schara." And the Gemaras and everyone learn that what it means is you should eat it, but you can't involve yourselves in selling it. You can enjoy it, but you can't turn it into a whole thing where you own everything and you're trying to sell it, because again, that goes against the very fundamental concept of Shemitah. You can't sell something that's not yours. That's just not right. But you can eat it. And here's the key line. He says, "V'nichvala zos ha-mitzvah," and this mitzvah was said multiple times, twice, "V'achlu avyonei amecha," that even the poor people amongst you should eat it. Shelo amar le'avyonei amecha ta'azovosam. It didn't say you should abandon all your fruits to the poor people. It said achila. It said you should eat it, and that the poor people should eat it, and that everyone should eat it. So seemingly the way to learn this Ramban is that he's saying, yeah, you have to make everything ownerless. And yes, you can't work the land. But guess what? There's an additional mitzvah to Shemitah, and that is any of the fruits that did grow, there is a mitzvah to eat it, says the Torah. That's what the Ramban assumes. So if we were to stop here, we'd assume, okay, good, let's go. Let's try to get Shemitah. Let's try to get produce that eventually grew and was cut during Shemitah, and we'll eat it, and we'll get a mitzvah. It's not totally true, because commentaries on the Ramban basically argue. See, one commentary assumes he means it's really a mitzvah. Now that commentary also completely disregards that and said that makes no sense, and the Ramban made this up, and there's no mitzvah. but he does understand that the Ramban does think it's a mitzvah. The more classic approach is the Chazon Ish, because the Chazon Ish says that the Ramban never meant that it's a mitzvah. He was just noting it's interesting that the language says that one should eat, and he has a bunch of proofs, but ultimately the Chazon Ish basically says you might fulfill, it's a nice idea to eat fruit, and let's say you did eat Shemitta fruit, you did eat fruit that was produced during Shvius, so it might be a positive thing, but there's no mitzvah to specifically eat that. And we'll get to, there are certainly differences later on and why that matters. But for where we stand now, there's really no reason to go searching after Shvius. We don't have to run after to find these fruits. I will say that Rav Rimon, Rav in Alon Shvut, is that? Down near the Gush. So Rav Rimon has a fantastic sefer on Shemitah, both in English and Hebrew. And he writes beautifully about the opportunity to be able to eat Shvius. And he agrees, while it might not be a mitzvah, he said, you have this opportunity once every 7 years to be able to eat fruit that Hashem specifically says, this is not yours, it's holy. So why wouldn't a person want to be able to get that? So as Ray Rosenbaum will touch upon next week, there's so many ways out of it. There's so many ways to avoid having to eat Shvius and having to purchase these fruits. But Rav Rimon just writes, he says, why would a person try to get out of that? It's a beautiful thing to be able to eat Shemitah. It's an amazing thing, an amazing opportunity. So Rav Rimon writes very strongly. And personally, I'm hoping, Hashem, maybe at some point I should be able to go to Eretz Yisrael this year. And one of the reasons being, besides for the fact that, I miss my family there and it's Eretz Yisrael, but Shemitah, I get to eat Shemitta fruits. That's a big deal. So again, maybe not a mitzvah, but certainly a positive thing that we should, in some ways, be pining to be able to do. So let's just understand, backing up, we said that there are certain fruits that are sacred during this year. So what does that mean, right? We're not allowed to work the land. We're not allowed to, grow things specifically. So then what are the fruits that grew that we would consider, fundamentally holy, fundamentally full of Kedusha? So Rashi in source 4, skipping source 4, the Gemara in source 5 says as follows, that Be'echa B'Tishrei, on the first of Tishrei, the Hebrew month, the first of the year, is the Rosh Hashanah L'Shanim. It's the Rosh Hashanah for the years, how we calculate years, right? As we know. L'Shmitin, it's the Rosh Hashanah, it's the first day of Shemitah, meaning every year Rosh Hashanah, every 7 years when Rosh Hashanah hits, that's when Shemitah starts. And for calculating the Yovel year, the Jubilee year. Fine. So after the brackets, the Gemara says, Amar Rabba, Amar Rabbanan, the rabbi said, how do I know what counts as the year for something that was planted? See, if I planted a vegetable 5 months ago in the 6th year, so it's not actually going to be picked until the 7th year, but it didn't really grow in the 7th year, at least not much. So is that a holy fruit? Is that subject to all these rules? So the Gemara says it depends on what? Be'ilan, when it comes to a tree, basar chanta. A tree, how do you decide which year it grew in? It goes based on when it budded. When the fruits were budding, when the fruits were first emerging, that's whatever year they stand in. So for most of the fruits, at least in the beginning of the 7th year, most of those fruits, in fact, all of them in the first 3 months, totally did not bud, didn't blossom during that 7th year. They were all the 6th year. So in the beginning of Shemitah, you don't really have to worry about fruits having these laws of holiness, because fruits have aren't thrown into the 7th year yet. You have to wait until 6 or 7 months into the Shemitah year to worry that maybe these grew and budded and blossomed in the Shemitah year and are subject to these laws. So that's trees. Then he says, Tavua v'zesem, let's say olives and let's say wheats, basar shlish, they go after a third of their growth. So if a third of their growth was in the previous year, they're considered 6-year fruits. If a third of their growth happened already in the 7th year, then those are also subject to these rules. And the last one, which is most applicable to us initially in Shemitah, is a yerek, which are vegetables, basar l'kita. Vegetables go based on when they're picked. So immediately as Shemitah hits, almost any fruits, almost any vegetables that are on the market are now applicable to these laws. So any vegetables, because as soon as they're picked in the 7th year, those are holy fruits. So each of these, and I don't think we should get into the exact details now why it is, but in short, each of these depend on when the main growth, the most integral growth of it happens, and how much is it gaining from what it's attached to. And for that reason, they gave these different, they enumerated these different levels for each of these fruits or the vegetables and the like. But for our purpose is just to realize that it all depends on when things are budding or when things are being picked. Now, we don't really have to figure that out because there are many charts online which will say, avocados are picked here, picked then, and most of the stores that we would go to in Israel would already, they would have the laws kind of laid out, or you would trust their kashrus. That's just to realize. So now, let's assume everything from before. Let's assume that it's a 7th year fruit, okay? So that means it's subject to a lot of rules. Let's assume that it's either a fruit or a vegetable at whatever point, and there's no mitzvah to eat it, but there is something very, very important, and this is where it gets into the practical halacha, and that is, how do I treat this? See, when it comes to holy things, we know you can't just throw it into the garbage. So while I might not have a mitzvah to eat it, there's certain ways I have to treat the fruit. And this becomes a very, I won't even say hard, it becomes a very beautiful, yet slightly complicated aspect of living in Israel during this time, during Shemitah, of how exactly to deal with the food. So let's look at source 6. So the Gemara outlines as follows. Rebbe Eloi cuts kafnaisa d'shvius. Rebbe Eli chopped down a palm tree that had unripe dates on it, right? They weren't ready to be eaten, and during Shvius, during the 7th year, he cut it down. So they asked, Hechi avi hachi, why were you allowed to do that? La'achla amar Rachmana. The Torah says the fruits of the 7th year are permitted for you to eat v'lo lahafsid. You can't just ruin it. See, when the Torah said that you're allowed to eat it during the 7th year, yes, eat it, but not wantonly destroy it or hurt it or ruin it. So that right there is one of the first basic halachos when it comes to these holy fruits, as we'll call them, the Shvius fruits, the 7th year fruits, that we're not allowed to needlessly destroy it. We can't take food from the 7th year and throw it out. We can't throw it in the garbage. We can't take food from the 7th year and destroy it. If something's growing on a tree and you're not planning on eating it, in general, it's a problem. But specifically during the 7th year, you can't just chop down this tree. It says you're not allowed to ruin it. You're allowed to eat it, and that's all. And again, and I will keep highlighting this just because I think that this is the running theme. Why not? Because we're not the owners. We're not the owners of the land. We're not the owners of the fruit. Hashem is. Okay, it happens to be in my property, so to say. But that doesn't mean I can just go and chop it down. Again, it's God's. If that was someone else's, I couldn't just go chop it down in their field. A friend, a family might let me take from their fruits, but he wouldn't let me chop it and ruin it. So too here, we're not the owners, and Hashem says, take care of it. You can eat it, but don't ruin it. That's the first halacha. So how does it actually play a role, right? So there are 2 levels. There are 2 different types of food. And let's see one more source, and then we'll talk a lot of these cases outside. So on the back side, on page 2, the Rambam in source 7 says like this, Klal Gadol. Here's the rule. If you want to know the rule, here's the principle. Amru b'shvius, kol shehu meichel adam o meichel behema. Anything that is human food or animal food, o memin hatzovim, or it's something used for coloring or for dyeing. Im einam miskayim ba'aretz, yeshlo udamav shvius. So the Rambam is outlining a separate halacha that we'll get to, but the most important thing that he's saying here is there's a general rule. Any food for humans or animals has application to the 7th year. And that is, if something is, inedible, if it's just wood from a tree, that doesn't have this inherent holiness. What has this holiness that we have to treat it properly is something that's edible either for us or animals. So, okay, it's holy, but what does that mean? How do I treat it? If I can't throw out any food, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. I can't even compost it. That's what we're saying. Because if I throw something into the compost, well, it was edible a second ago. If it lands in the compost, well, between you and me, I'm not picking that up and eating it. So essentially, you just ruined it, right? So how do you treat Shemitta fruit, Shvius fruit? So the general suggestions go as follows. We can't throw it directly into a garbage. So many people are lenient to always carry around bags, right? If a person goes around to the shuk in Israel and they want to eat some fruit, so you have some fruit, you eat it, and let's say you have a leftover that you don't want to eat, or there's still some fruit left on the pit. You can't just throw it out. So people deposit them in plastic bags and then put them in the garbage. That's one route. Now, why does that help? Well, you aren't then ruining the fruit. That's called causing, right? That's a causation. It's not you directly ruining anything. If I put it in a bag, it'll stay in the garbage. At some point in the bag, it'll rot and it'll go bad on its own. And then it'll be thrown into a garbage heap. I didn't ruin it per se, right? It goes bad on its own, and that's okay. Now, a lot of people are very sensitive to the nature of the holiness of these fruits and to the nature of Shemitah. So it's become very common to actually have what people call a Shemitah garbage. That is a really poor term because your Shemitah garbage, I thought the whole point is I'm not putting Shemitah, that this holiness using with the word garbage doesn't work so nicely. So what people call them is a Shemitah pail, okay? Semantics, call it what you will, but it's a Shemitah pail. And what that means is in their kitchen, they have their regular garbage. And next to their regular garbage, they actually have a pail, another bin, okay? I'm just avoiding that, sullied word, garbage. They have another pail in which they put Shemitah. So let's say every day I'm chopping up, let's say I have carrots that grew during the 7th year. So I'm chopping those up and the heads are still edible, certainly for animals. So what they do is they throw the heads into that into that bin. I have to also get in the habit. I read Rav Rimon basically really doesn't like the word trash and garbage with shvius, and I appreciate that sensitivity. I think it's very beautiful. So try not. But you take the tops of the carrots and you throw them in that plastic bag. Then you can do that for whatever you're cutting because it'll be in the plastic bag. It'll go bad on its own, no problem. At the end of the day, though, tie it off and leave it there and put it in another plastic bag because if I just keep throwing things in there, so yesterday's garbage is now going to make whatever I throw in there garbage today. So to be very careful of this, essentially each day they put it in a new bag, tie it off, and make sure that all the Shemitah stuff going in will just sit there. And then eventually they throw it out once it's gross and anyway, it's gone bad after a few days because then we're not ruining it, it's ruined itself. That's the general approach of how to deal with it. So this actually comes up in numerous ways. By the way, this all applies in America. If I somehow get fruits from Israel that didn't that have this application of holiness, and again, they didn't go through those other routes of that kind of avoid the issue, which we'll speak about next week. All these rules that we're talking about are applicable here. So if all of a sudden Shalom's is carrying, carrots, and you see they're from Israel, so presumably they know what they're doing and they're not getting ones that would have this issue. But again, you go to these random Asian markets and sometimes they do get imports from Israel. And if it says from Israel, you have to kind of do your research because it might be Shemitah fruit, in which case, here too, we have to follow these rules. So what happens if you made a soup, right? I used vegetables from Shemitah and I made a soup. So the entire soup becomes holy, technically, right? Gave off holy taste, right? One second, let's see. Costco, right? Okay, good. That's a good thing to know. Costco is definitely not on their game as far as their Jewish halachos. I'll tell you that. And they don't know. So if you get fruits from Costco and it says from Israel, so you have to research has to be done. We don't have to do it ourselves. The OU, the Star K is pretty on top of these things, so we can look online. But thank you for that. So, but the point is when you cook shvius, when you cook these fruits, so it turns whatever you're cooking into that holiness as well. So then if you have leftover soup after Shabbos from all this Shemitah fruit, you can't just throw it down the drain. You can't just throw it out because again, that's throwing it to the garbage. So either you can put it in a plastic bag or you can leave it out overnight and no one's eating soup after it's been left out overnight. If you are, you don't have to admit it, But once you leave soup overnight, it went bad on its own, and you can just throw it out normally and it'd be okay. So again, the problem is for us to make it bad. What about leftovers, right? If someone had a nice, great meal, it's Shemitta fruit, Shemitta vegetables, so they're on my plate. What do I do with my leftovers? So you have to take off all the, main stuff that you wouldn't put in the sink, all the extra food, and all the, the little gross stuff on the bottom is totally fine because no one would eat that anyway. That's kind of gross as it is. The most applicable case, all these are applicable, but really comes up with pits, shells, and peels, right? So let's say I'm eating a fruit in Israel, or a fruit comes here, and I was about to say peach. I don't know. Does Israel have peaches? I don't know. Okay. So you're eating, what's a good fruit from Israel that besides a Rimon? So I can't think. Okay. What, Lisa?
Orange peel.
Oranges. Oh, perfect. Oranges. Yes. Oranges. That's the perfect example here. So orange peels. Now, orange peels are technically, I don't know, are they edible for animals? Not sure. But let's say I peel my orange, and I'm not so good at peeling oranges. In fact, I just give them to my wife to peel usually. But I can't peel them so well. So usually if I peel them, it means there's orange pieces still stuck to the peels. So if that's true, I can't just throw out the peel because again, it has edible fruit on it. The same would be if there's something with a pit and there's still some level of fruit on it. So while I might not be eating it, let's say like an apple core still has edible fruit on it. So you can't just throw that to the wayside, throw it into the garbage or throw it on the street, because certainly another person technically could eat that, or certainly an animal could. So these are the types of things we have to be very sensitive to, very careful during Shemitah. It's not just regular food, it's pits and shells and the like that when we're finished, we have to deposit them in a bag before we put them in the garbage. So you'll see in Eretz Yisrael, people literally walk around with, bags. You think they're walking a dog or whatever, the bags to pick up after the dog, but really they're walking around with these things of bags in order, if they have a snack, they have somewhere to put it in order that they're not just going to ruin this holy fruit. So the real question is, though, I'm glad you bring up oranges. See, orange peels, they're not edible for a human. I mean, I guess people candy orange peels, it's true, but for the most part, they're not really edible. But technically an animal might eat them, and it could be edible for an animal. So how do I treat that? So the Chazon Ish in source 8, right in the middle, at the last two lines, he says, Rov ha'am ba'oso makom. We go based on majority of people in that area. So if majority of people give this to their animals, then that's something that would be fitting for animals, and that too we have to treat with a certain level of holiness. If it's something no one gives to their animals, like a peach pit, no one gives a peach pit to an animal, then at that point, that's not holy and that can be discarded as long as it doesn't have any fruit on it. So that's the general, just again, the fruits that are grown during Shemitah that don't have all the other dispensations that we'll talk about next week have a certain level of holiness. We have to treat it properly, which means we can't cause it to be ruined or destroyed, in which case we have to put it in ways into the garbage or the like that help avoid that, and then it's just happens on its own. So that's as far as eating and how we treat it afterwards. Now there is another halacha, and this comes very much into play, and that is in source 9. So the Rambam in source 9 says, Lo yishana peiros mibriyasan. A person cannot change fruits from how they were created, meaning for their purpose. Kederach she'eino mishana b'truma. That we have a halacha that when it comes to truma and other sacred things in Israel tithes, a person can't use them for something other than what they would normally be used for. So he kind of spells it out. If something would normally be eaten raw, you shouldn't cook it, and vice versa. And if something is normally given to animals to eat, so we shouldn't eat it, and vice versa. And it goes back to this idea, we're not the owners. And if you're not an owner of something, you can't misuse an object in a way that it's not intended. So this can be very applicable to juicing, for example. If something's not normally juiced, so technically according to this halacha, you couldn't take a fruit from the 7th year and juice it. That's not how it's eaten. That's not normal. That's doing something abnormal. Now, the good thing is everything is juiced these days. I can't think of a vegetable or fruit that people don't juice. If you have one, go ahead and send it over to the chat. I'd be surprised. I'm pretty sure everything is juiced. So usually it's okay. There is one thing though, to take a lemon from the 7th year and use it to get out a stain on clothing. So that would be a problem. Lemons, their intended use, so to say, is not for that. Their intended use is to eat it and to consume it. So to use it to get out a stain on your shirt, that would be that would be inappropriate and against halacha, and basically a disregard of the inherent holiness of the fruit. Okay, so again, that's kind of the summation of how we treat the fruits. We'll pause here if anyone has any questions on that. Yes. 1 second. I can't hear you. I see you unmuted yourself, but we can't hear you. All right. Well, not yet. If you want, you can type it if you can't get it going. Okay. So we'll wait if you put in the chat or somehow get your the what's called audio working. But sure, any other questions before we go on? Okay, Ruth, I apologize, but you can also, if you remember, so you can save it for the end, and I'll make sure to remember we can discuss it then. So here we go. All right. So basically, ad kan, the halachos, the laws of how you exactly treat the fruits. Now, again, because these fruits are holy, because they're holy, we have to treat them with a certain level of respect. And that means that there's another halacha, and that is in source 10. If we look over here, there's an interesting thing that happens when you purchase fruits. Lakach beperosh shvius. Let's say you purchased fruits from the 7th year. And then what you did with this is you purchased meat with it. So, right, I have fruits. Instead of using money, I traded fruits for meat. Elu ve'elu mitbarim b'shvius, meaning each of these have inherent holiness and will be subject to the later halacha that we'll learn about removing it from your house at a certain point in the year. Lakach basa v'dagim. Let's say I purchased meat or fish with that meat. So then yatsa basar v'nichnesu dagim. So it goes from the meat to the fish. Essentially like this. I have fruits that are holy. If I trade them out for meat, so then that meat becomes holy. And if I take that meat and trade it out for fish, the fish becomes holy. And essentially the holiness is transferred from one item to the other. Now, what that means is the fruits, the initial fruits, always stay in their level of holiness. So we always have to treat them properly. But technically anything else that's switched out for it becomes holy as well. And you're thinking, well, I don't really trade meat for fruits. It's true, but I trade money for fruits. So here is where it gets a little complicated. And that is that if I pay cash for fruits that are subject to Shvius, the 7th year, that cash becomes imbued with holiness. And now I'm stuck because that cash is now limited what I can do with it. Because again, this holiness means we have to treat it that way. So in source 11, 1 second, I'm just looking at your question. Isn't it better for the environment and kedusha of the land? 1 second, because I want to stay on this topic of talking about the trading out. So Mitzvah Hashem will address this at the end. So again, the cash now has a certain level of holiness. So how do we treat that? So look at source 11. The Mishnah says, "Ein lokhin avadim v'karkos ubehema tmeya midmei shvius." You cannot purchase slaves. You cannot purchase land. You cannot purchase non-kosher animals with the money of shvius of the 7th year. Nimlakach yochel kenegdan. And if you did so you have to essentially trade those for something else, right? If I bought, I used holy money that I had used someone paid me for my fruits, and now I have cash that was used to trade for holy fruits. So, and then I use that cash to buy, I don't know, a pig. That's a problem. What I then need to do with that pig is I need to set aside X amount of money worth that pig, or X amount of fruits worth that pig, and treat those with holiness. Because again, if something is traded out for these fruits, it itself is imbued with holiness, and we have to treat it accordingly. So you can imagine that this becomes a problem, because in Israel, where you have stores selling not just things that had dispensations from these laws, but they also have fruits that are subject to the laws of Shemitah, which many people do try to eat. So when people go into a store and pay cash for these fruits, now you have an entire cash register full of money that's essentially holy and has to be treated accordingly. And that means if I go into the store and get change, now I have a problem, because I have money in my hand that I can't just go buy detergent with. I have this money that I can't just go buy something that's not edible with. I have to buy specifically kosher edible things. So what do I do with that money? Now that's a problem. So what they suggest is, if you know that this store sells these types of fruits, and therefore you know that there's a very high chance that it has holy money. So what you have to do is, when you get this change or you get this money, you essentially state any holy money, any money that has this status of the seventh year upon it, I now transfer to a fruit. And that fruit you treat with holiness. You transfer, you say that, and now you can use the cash for whatever you want. And the fruit itself now has to be treated with integrity, with holiness. And that's essentially what people do. Now, this is usually only applicable with cash, because if you're using check or credit, so there's nothing that really, you need something tangible. You need something of real value. Cash or credit, credit or check is really just something you owe, right? You're paying now, and you're giving them your card, but really you're paying it back later. So that's one way around this issue of having money that's you have to treat with holiness. The other way is when people purchase fruits in Israel, what they essentially, it's not like I purchase my fruits and then I purchase my detergent and I purchase this. Yeah, you have your whole grocery cart. So you put it on the counter, and essentially let's say everything comes out to $100, including the fruits. So what you say is, forget the fruits. I'm buying everything for $100 and throw the fruits in for free. So that's what they say, because essentially it's, yes, you could call a loophole, but what you're essentially saying is the fruits, I'm not purchasing with this money. So that money is actually going towards other things, and you're giving me the fruits. And then there's no transfer from the fruits to the money, and the money is not a problem. But again, most applicable to us would be if we visit Israel and we want to go to one of these fruit stores and I get cash back. So I should just be careful with that money. And best thing would be to state, I transfer the holiness of this money onto the following fruits, and then treat those fruits as you would any other holy fruits. That's the general approach. There's one more main halacha, and then we'll stop for, I'm sure there are a number of questions. So again, to review, fruits can be holy if they're grown in Israel without those dispensations that we'll learn about next week. And therefore, like anything holy, we have to treat it with a certain respect. So we can't throw it out. We can't purposefully ruin it. That's one. We also have to treat it properly. And so the purpose for which it's grown, that's what it has to be used for. We can't just use it for anything else. And the last thing that we talked is that it also, how we purchase things. The holiness transfers, and it moves from one item to the next, and therefore any cash or anything that I use to purchase these fruits has to be treated with a certain sense of holiness as well. But again, since the kedusha, since the holiness can transfer, I can always say, well, any money that's holy in my possession, I now transfer onto these fruits, and I treat those as I would any others. Okay, so this is applicable most of the year during Shemitah. Now, at some point during Shemitah, there comes a time that, as the psukim describe, that it will be accessible to your animals, to the wild animals and the like. So at some point, there comes a time that the fruits in the field and the vegetables are no longer accessible to animals because they've been picked, clean, and there's nothing there anymore. And it's gone to the market, and basically the season's over. So by, middle of Shemitah, Many fruits and vegetables, their season is over. So when the season for a vegetable is over, which means it's no longer being picked in the field and it's no longer being sold in the market, there comes in one last halacha. And that halacha is what we call biur, which means eradication, getting rid of, right? It sounds familiar. Pesach, biur chametz, getting rid of chametz. So come this point in the season, when it's out of season and it's no longer being sold, the Torah says, as expounded in Torah's Kohanim in source 12 as follows. Ukishu Omer, when the pasuk states, Ulbehemtecha ulachaya, and it shall be accessible to your animals and to the wild animals. Makish behema lachaya, the Torah juxtaposes the animal to the wild animal, as if to say, Kol zman shechaya ochelas basada, behema ochelas babayas. So long as the wild animal eats outside, the animals can eat inside. But when it's no longer in season and available for the animals outdoors, it can no longer be available for the animals indoors. Which means there comes a point at the end of the season that essentially I have to say, all right, well, I still have avocados in my home. They're out of season. So what do I do with them? The Torah is basically dictating that when they're not accessible to be eaten outdoors by, the wild animals, I'm not allowed to eat it indoors anymore. Again, to highlight, I don't own this. There's someone else dictating when we can eat it, how we can eat it, and the like. So what's the process? What do they do? And this completely happens in Israel. It's a fascinating thing to watch. And source 13, we'll say it outside, that essentially what you do, and the Rambam says this as well, is people take all the fruits that are out of season at their home, at whatever point it goes out of season, and everyone takes it, puts it outside and says, it's ownerless. I do not own it anymore. It's ownerless. It's not mine. I'm not allowed to have it. Once they make it ownerless, it means anyone and everything can take it. It means you could also take it. So if there's no guy next door eyeing your fruits, so you say it's ownerless, give it a few seconds, pick it right back up, and you can be indoors and you just reacquired. But technically, I could go next door as my neighbor does, and I could also acquire his fruits that way because they're ownerless. They're not his anymore. And that's essentially the process of what they do. In Israel, people bring it outside, they lift it up, they put it out and say, it's ownerless, anyone can take, it's no longer mine, and they have to do it before 3 people, a beis din, a court. It can be friends, it can be next door neighbors, no one in your house per se, but it can be people who are going to allow you to take it back. But essentially people say, it's ownerless, it's not mine, done. And then people can take what they need for food and they can bring it back into their home. And that happens at the end of the season. Again, to highlight, it's really not ours. As much as it might seem like it's ours, and we own it, we brought it into our houses, it's not ours. And that's kind of the summation of what happens during Shemitah, from the inception of the fruit when it's first grown to if it's applicable to the 7th year, and if it is applicable to the 7th year and it didn't undergo any of the dispensations and it didn't grow under any of the other circumstances that remove its holiness. So then there are certain ways we treat it, and certain ways we treat the things that we use to purchase it. And again, come the end of the season, it's also no longer ours, and we have to demonstrate that as well. The last thing, just in 2 more minutes, we'll say this outside. Rav Chaim Kanievsky explains it very nicely. There's a rabbinic law that since the psukim say be'artsecha, that it'll be for you to eat in your land, there's a din d'Rabbanan, there's a rule from the rabbis that you're not really supposed to bring fruits outside, from Israel to outside, right? Fruits from the 7th year should stay in Israel. Again, they're holy, the land is holy, they should stay where it's holy. They were worried, the rabbis essentially were worried that people are used to keeping Shemitah in Israel. They know what they're doing there. But people outside don't really know what's flying, right? We're not as intimately familiar with it. And so basically, it should stay in Israel. We shouldn't take it out. Rav Chaim Kanievsky basically brings this up, and he says it's true. That being said, if someone's on a trip, you're in Israel, and now you're flying back home to America or wherever you're going, so you can take a few fruits and a few things to eat on your way. But you just can't take a lot. And again, whatever you take still has all the rules, even though we're not in Israel. It follows all the rules that we talked about before. That's just a general hashkafa, a general idea. Again, I hate to say it again, but it's just the most integral idea of Shemitah. It's not ours. It's all Hashem's. in the land of Israel, a place where that's where there's inherent kedusha, inherent holiness, that's where the fruit should stay. And again, that's ideally. So we see a lot of imported fruits from Israel sometimes, as we say in Costco or other places. So if they're being imported, either it's because that people don't know that halacha, and a lot of these stores might not. More likely, it's coming without the inherent holiness because it was grown under certain dispensations. Again, that will be Mirz Hashem next week with Rabbi Rosenbaum. That I'm sure will prove to be a very interesting share, because that's the most controversial about how fruits essentially are removed from the status of holiness, how they're removed from being considered fruits of the seventh year. Okay, so we have a few questions. So before I even open up for questions, but again, technically it's over now. So if people would like to go, don't feel the need to stay. But I'll answer a few questions from the chat, and then if anyone has anything further to ask, we'll talk. So one of the questions is, what about money from a bank? You don't know what has been used to purchase before you. So if you're withdrawing money in a bank in Israel, that might be a problem, right? Again, the idea being is maybe that money was used to purchase kedusha shvius, fruits that are holy and subject to the seventh year, and then the money became holy itself. So it's a good question. We generally say, and this is the approach, that we don't assume something to be money that is kadosh from shvius, that it's holy, unless we know otherwise. So in a fruit store that 100% sells fruit, so then we know that money very, very, very likely has kedusha. But in most cases in the banks, you don't know that money. The money that you put in is not the money you're taking out. And so as a general whole, we assume that it's not, and it's totally fine. So that's a good question though. And then to go back to this question before, isn't it better for the environment and the kedusha of the land to compost them, meaning the fruits? They would also be edible for animals. It just seems to be so contrary to the ecology to use a plastic bag for every little item. This is a very good thing. I always say for every little plastic thing, I'm killing a little baby turtle. I feel really bad. Those like videos of little turtles coming out of there, on the beach trying to make their way to the ocean, and then somehow they get stuck in a plastic bottle. It's really sad, being honest here. So those plastic bags, right? It's really bad for the economy. Really bad for the ecology, the environment. So yes, I am definitely not a proponent of using plastic bags for everything. I'm sure paper bags would do as well. Just anything to separate. Now, compost, it's an interesting question. Throwing into a compost technically wouldn't ruin it. Yes, it might be edible for an animal to eat, while a human might not eat it once it's in the compost. But again, what you're then doing is you're taking an edible food for humans and downgrading it to animal food right now. And so if its intended purpose was for human food and now you downgraded it, we're not supposed to do that. So I think that's generally it. Now, what people can do, and this is probably an ideal way to do it, would be you could put it in paper bags. And once you wait a day or two, once it's kind of gross already, then you could throw it into a compost even without the bag. So yeah, I'm definitely, no one should walk away from this sheer thinking that we should use 30 plastic bags a day. Okay, we'll just leave it at that. All right, any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
All right, so you talked about, someone buys the shvi fruit and, the holiness transfers to the money. How is the original person, if the shvi fruit is supposed to be hefker anyway, how is the original person selling it in the first place? It's not that person's to sell.
Right. So it's a very good question. There are two routes, one of which I'm not going to answer because that's next week's share, and I don't know enough. Yes, correct. There are ways that fruits are collected and sold, as Ari was just saying, through Otzer Bezdin, where essentially, a court or a system works through halachic ways and proper halachic approaches to own all the fruits in Israel, but they don't really own it. What they're doing is, it's not obviously recognized as Hashem's. They're just taking it all from all the individuals and in a kind of a socialist way, allocating it and giving it out. So there are systems in order to allow the sale, in order to allow farmers to be able to make a living and they can't obviously work the land, but anything that was grown, they can sell. That's one approach. Again, I don't want to get into the exact details because that really will be next week, and Ray Rosenbaum will address this. The second answer is that the Torah forbade kind of gathering and selling it in the normal fashion. So if a person just takes a bunch that would be enough for a few meals for a family, that would be permissible to sell, almost as if, because I'm not saying this entire field is mine and I'm gathering it all right now and selling it as I normally do. I'm doing something very differently. And as soon as someone does something very differently, it's a demonstration that I realize this year it's not mine. Otherwise, I'd be doing it like I want, as normal. So many fruit sellers, if they're not selling through those dispensations that will be discussed next week, sell less than they would over certain periods of time. And that's kind of one route.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I was disappointed. Last week we didn't end off with a really hard question that I didn't know, and I had to come back to everyone. So I'm waiting, All right, fine. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate
Sure.
everyone coming out. And
Thank you.
next week, we look forward to hearing from Rabbi Rosenbaum, really get into the real details of how to purchase fruits.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, have a good night.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.